The stagecoach from Billings ran 2 hours late, which gave Caleb Dawson plenty of time to second-guess every decision he'd made in the last 6 months. He stood outside the relay station with his hat in his hands and his stomach doing something it hadn't done in years. Not quite nerves. Something closer to the feeling he got before a hard winter, that particular stillness in the air that tells a man something is coming, and he's not entirely sure he's ready for it. He'd been a widower for 4 years. 4 years of managing the ranch alone, cooking badly, sleeping on his side of a bed that felt about 3 times wider than it used to. His foreman, a steady man named Amos, had finally said what everyone around him had been thinking. "You need a partner, Caleb, not a housekeeper. A partner." So he'd written to the agency in Boston, filled out their forms, answered their questions honestly, described himself as 36 rancher widower, no children, reasonably patient, not much for conversation, but not unkind. Described the ranch as modest but solid. Described Montana as hard but honest. He'd received a letter back from a woman named Eleanor Hart. Her handwriting was careful, precise. Every sentence measured like she'd written each one twice before committing it to paper. She described herself as 28, educated, capable of hard work, accustomed to managing a household. She said she was looking for a fresh start in a place where the air was clean and the past couldn't follow quite so easily. That last line had stayed with him. A place where the past couldn't follow quite so easily. He'd read it 3 times and hadn't written back to ask what she meant. He figured a person had a right to their reasons. They'd exchanged 7 letters over 6 months. She was intelligent, that came through clearly. She asked good questions about the ranch, the land, the seasons. She asked about his neighbors. She asked what the winters were actually like, not the polite version people told strangers. She didn't ask much about him personally, and he didn't push. He figured they had time. The stagecoach finally rolled in just past 3 in the afternoon. 3 passengers climbed down. A traveling merchant who went straight for the station door. An older couple who were met immediately by family. And then her. Eleanor Hart stepped off the stagecoach and reached for the rail at the last second, her knees dipping in a way that made Caleb's chest tighten before he even knew why. She caught herself. Straightened. Released the rail like she hadn't needed it at all. Picked up her single suitcase and turned to face whoever was waiting. She was beautiful. That registered somewhere in the back of his mind the way a fact registers noted, filed away, not dwelt on. What he actually focused on was everything else. The way she held her body. Too careful. Too controlled. Every movement slightly deliberate, like a woman who'd learned to calculate the cost of moving wrong. The way her eyes swept the area before they settled on him. Not curious. Assessing. The eyes of someone who'd learned to read a room for danger before reading it for anything else. The way she didn't smile when she recognized him, or rather when she figured out he must be him because she didn't know his face any more than he knew hers. Most men would have walked forward with their hand out and a big grin tried to put her at ease with noise and motion. Caleb stayed where he was. He gave her the distance to come to him on her own terms. She crossed the yard steadily, stopped 3 feet away, met his eyes directly that surprised him a little. Whatever she wasn't a shrinking woman. "Mr. Dawson," she said. "Miss Hart." He nodded once. "Welcome to Montana." A pause. She seemed to be waiting for something more, words maybe, or some kind of assessment of her that she was bracing for. When neither came, something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. "Is it always this cold in September?" she asked. "No," he said. "Sometimes it's colder." She looked at him for one moment, and then not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. The ghost of something that had once lived in her face and hadn't fully died. "Good to know," she said. He reached for her suitcase. She didn't let go immediately. Just a half-second, fingers tightening on the handle before she released it, and he pretended not to notice. Just took the bag and turned toward the wagon without comment. They rode the first mile in silence. It wasn't uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who understood that words cost something and weren't going to spend them carelessly. Then Caleb said without looking at her, Did you have anything to eat today? She turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the road. I had something at the last station, she said, early this morning. There's food at the ranch. Martha Callahan from the neighboring spread left a pot of stew last night. She figured you'd be tired when you arrived. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. That was kind of her. Martha's a good woman. She lost her husband 3 years back, runs her place alone. She'll want to meet you when you're ready. No rush on that. Another silence. Then Eleanor said carefully, You said in your letter the winters start early here. Mid-October usually, some years late September. And you manage the ranch with just yourself and your foreman. Amos in 2 hands. Amos has been with me 12 years. A beat. He's a little suspicious of strangers, but he comes around. I can manage suspicious, she said quietly. He glanced at her, then just briefly. She was looking straight ahead at the road, and something in her profile told him that sentence had come from a much deeper place than small talk. She's been managing suspicious her whole life, he thought, and said nothing. The ranch house was plain and solid and clean in the way that a man's house is clean when he's tried harder than usual. Eleanor noticed that immediately. She noticed, too, that the bedroom door, her bedroom had a lock on it. A new one from the look of the hardware, recently installed. She stood in the doorway for a moment staring at that lock. Behind her, Caleb set down her suitcase and said as if remarking on the weather, I figured a woman living in a strange place with a man she doesn't know ought to have a lock on her door. Keys on the dresser. She turned around slowly. He was already walking back toward the kitchen, his back to her, giving her space to have whatever reaction she needed to have without an audience. Eleanor stood there in the doorway of that room for a long time after he left. She'd lived in a house for 6 years, where the locks worked against her, not for her. She'd slept in a room where the door opened whenever someone decided it should open, and no amount of wanting it otherwise had ever made a difference. She had come to believe in the way that people believe things that have been proven to them repeatedly that locks on doors were not for women like her. She picked up the key from the dresser, held it in her palm. Small piece of iron. Almost nothing. It felt like the most important object she'd ever held. She set it back down, unpacked her suitcase with methodical care, and went to help with supper. The kitchen was warm and smelled like wood smoke and the stew Martha had left. Caleb was adding wood to the stove when she came in, and he moved aside without being asked, naturally giving her room to get to the pot without navigating around him. She noticed that too, the way he moved in his own house like he was conscious of taking up space. Not in the defeated way of a small man trying to make himself smaller. In the deliberate way of a large man who understood what it meant when a person needed room. I can take over, she said. Already done mostly. You can cut the bread if you want. He nodded toward the counter. Knife sharp. She cut the bread. He set the table. They ate with the quiet efficiency of 2 people who'd both been living alone and had forgotten the particular negotiation of sharing a meal with another human being. Halfway through supper, he said, I should tell you about the ranch, what needs doing, what the routine looks like, but that can wait until tomorrow if you're tired. Tell me now, she said. I'd rather know. He looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't quite name, not surprise exactly, more like recognition, like she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. So he told her. The cattle operation, the acreage, the water rights, the condition of the fencing in the south pasture. He talked about the ranch the way a man talks about something he loves and is worried about honestly without performance. He mentioned the land dispute last almost as an afterthought in the careful tone of a man who'd been trying not to let a problem take up more room than it deserved. Victor Crowley, he said, county land official. He's been pushing the boundary survey for the last 18 months. Claiming the deed on the east parcel is improperly recorded. His people resubmitted a corrected survey that moves the line about 40 acres in his favor. That's a significant amount of land. It's the water access. The acreage doesn't matter as much as the creek running through it. He set down his fork. I've been trying to fight it through the county records office, but Crowley has people there. Every time I find a document, something goes missing or gets misfiled. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. My father was an attorney in Boston. Land disputes were a significant part of his practice. Caleb went still in the way a man goes still when he doesn't want to seem too interested in something. Is that right? He taught me to read deeds and survey records when I was 14. He said every woman ought to understand property law because the law has never been designed with women's interests in mind, and understanding it was the only defense. A pause. I'm fairly good at finding errors in recorded documents. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. This one had weight. I'm not asking for your help with that, Caleb said finally. You just arrived. That's not... I know you're not asking, Eleanor said. I'm offering. She met his eyes steadily. If you'll show me the documents. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once the same way he'd greeted her at the station. Like a man who meant what he said and didn't need to say it twice. After I show you this property tomorrow, he said, we'll look at the documents. She locked her bedroom door that night. Not because she was afraid of Caleb Dawson. She wasn't, she realized, and that itself was strange enough to sit with for a while, that she could share a roof with a man she'd known for 6 hours and not feel the specific cold dread that had lived in her chest for most of the last decade. She locked it because she could. Because the lock was hers. Because no one was going to argue with her about it, or demand to know why she needed it, or tell her she was being foolish or dramatic or ungrateful. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to the silence, which was enormous and clean in the way that only open country silence is. No city sounds. No neighbors too close. No footsteps in the hall that made her go rigid. Just wind. And the distant sound of cattle. And the creak of a house settling around her. She thought about the question he'd asked. Did you have anything to eat today? Not you look beautiful. Not you're exactly what I expected. Not, I hope you're worth the trouble. Not any of the dozen things she'd steeled herself to hear. Just did you have anything to eat today? Like the most natural thing in the world. Like a person asking another person if they were hungry, because it mattered whether they were hungry, because they were a person, and people needed to eat. She pressed her fist against her sternum, where the tightness lived, and breathed slowly in the dark. She was not going to let herself trust this. She was not going to allow one quiet man and one simple question to undo 2,000 miles of careful armor. She'd built that armor in the specific shape of her survival, and she was not foolish enough to set it down because one evening had been unexpectedly gentle. But she noted it, filed it away, and she slept. The next morning, Caleb showed her the property. They rode the fence lines in the early light, and he talked about each section, the way a man talks about the things he's built or preserved or loved, specific, unhurried, honest about the problems. The south pasture fence needed work. The roof on the equipment shed had weathered badly. The creek in the east parcel ran well in spring and fall, thin in August, never dried fully even in the worst summers. She listened carefully and asked the right questions, and he noticed that too. The quality of her questions, the way they were practical and specific and missed nothing important. You know ranching, he said. I know enough. My uncle had a spread in Pennsylvania. I spent summers there when I was young. A pause. Before. She didn't finish the sentence. He didn't ask her to. When they reached the east parcel and the creek, she climbed down from her horse and walked to the bank without prompting, stood looking at the water with an expression that had nothing dreamy or romantic about it. She was calculating. This is what he wants, she said. The whole eastern operation runs off this water. Then the survey isn't actually about the land. She turned and looked at him. If he controls the creek access, he controls your ability to run cattle on half your property. You'd have to either sell the eastern parcel at whatever price he offered, or watch it die. That's exactly right. And you think the survey documents have been manipulated. I can't prove it. Every time I get close to something, it disappears. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. Then she said, Show me the original deed records, the ones from when your father acquired this land. How far back do you want to go? She looked at him steadily. How far back does Crowley's family go in this county? Something moved in his expression, then admiration, he supposed, though he'd have been embarrassed to name it. Far enough, he said. Then that's how far back I want to go. The document work started that evening. Caleb spread the land records across the kitchen table. Deeds, survey maps. County filing receipts going back 23 years, and Eleanor sat across from him and began to read. She read the way her father had taught her to read legal documents. Not for the content first, for the form, for the pattern, for the place where the pattern broke. Caleb watched her work and tried not to watch her work because there was something in the focused intensity of her concentration that felt private, like watching a person pray. He made coffee. He checked the documents she finished with and tried to follow her logic, and mostly succeeded. An hour in, she stopped. This filing date, she said, 1879. He came around the table, looked where she was pointing. What about it? This surveyor's mark. She put her finger on a small notation in the margin of the original survey. See the way the number 8 is formed. The top loop is closed, very distinctive. He looked, saw it. Now look at the corrected survey Crowley's office filed last year. She pulled the second document alongside it. Same surveyor's name, same mark, except... He saw it before she finished. The 8 was different. Open top. Different hand. The corrected survey wasn't filed by the same surveyor, he said. It was filed by someone imitating his mark. She sat back. Your original surveyor died in 1883. I saw his obituary listed in the county death records your lawyer included in this packet. Whoever filed the correction learned to copy his notation well enough to pass casual inspection, but nobody who knew his actual hand would have missed it. The silence in the kitchen was different from all the previous silences. This one crackled. Eleanor. His voice came out different than he intended. She looked up. How did you find that in an hour? Something crossed her face, complicated, layered. Something that was fighting with itself. She looked down at the documents again before she answered. My father made me practice for weeks before he was satisfied with my eye, she said. He said the law would try to fool me, and I had to be smarter than the lie. He sounds like a good man. A pause. He was. Her voice had gone somewhere slightly remote. He died before I... She stopped, realigned whatever she'd been about to say. He died 6 years ago. Caleb let the silence hold for a moment. Then he said quietly, I'll write to the county land records office in Helena, the territorial capital. Crowley doesn't have reach up there. Eleanor nodded, still not looking up from the papers. Thank you, he said, for this. She shook her head slightly, like the thanks made her uncomfortable. I'm useful, she said almost to herself. The words came out like something she was reminding herself of, or maybe proving. I'm still useful. He didn't respond to that directly. He just pulled another stack of documents toward himself and sat down across from her and kept working. And she stayed at that table past midnight, and the lamp burned low, and neither of them mentioned stopping. 3 weeks into Eleanor's time at the ranch, Martha Callahan came to call. Eleanor heard the wagon first and felt the familiar pull of wariness, even here. Even after 3 weeks of nothing happening, some part of her still cataloged every new arrival as a potential threat. She was learning to recognize that reflex for what it was. She hadn't yet learned to fully stop it. Martha climbed down from her wagon and was already talking before she'd fully reached the porch. She was a broad, energetic woman with gray streaking her hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing but managed to look kind while missing nothing, which Eleanor recognized as a particular kind of skill. You must be Eleanor, Martha said, reaching out and taking her hand in both of hers. Not a handshake, more like a claiming. I'm Martha Callahan. I've been Caleb's nearest neighbor for 14 years, and I am purely delighted to have another woman within shouting distance of this valley. You have no idea. Eleanor blinked. I've heard a great deal about you. Caleb talks about me. He said you were a good woman. Martha made a sound that was approximately a laugh. That man gives compliments the way some people give money, careful and rare, which means when he does it, you know he means it. She released Eleanor's hand and looked at her with those sharp, kind eyes. You settling in all right? Yes, Eleanor said. And then, because something in Martha's directness made evasion feel rude, it's different than I expected. Different how? Eleanor considered. Quieter, she said finally. I expected the ranch to be demanding, urgent. I expected to feel behind from the first day. And instead, it's just one thing after another, in order, without anyone panicking. A pause. I'm not used to that. Martha studied her for a moment with an expression that managed to be both gentle and completely clear-eyed. Where you came from, she said carefully. There was a lot of panicking. Eleanor met her eyes. There was a lot of everything. Martha nodded slowly. Well, she said, you're here now, and in my experience here has a way of eventually becoming home if you let it. She tilted her head toward the house. You going to offer me coffee, or should I pretend I was just passing through? Eleanor almost smiled. I'll put the pot on, she said. Jimmy yelled. Martha stayed 3 hours, which was long enough for Eleanor to understand that she was being befriended genuinely, not out of obligation or curiosity about her history, by a woman who had decided to do it and wasn't going to be discouraged by a quiet manner or careful answers. Caleb came in from the south pasture mid-afternoon and found them at the kitchen table with the remains of coffee and the spread of land documents between them, because Eleanor had ended up explaining what she'd found in the survey records, and Martha had turned out to have very pointed opinions about Victor Crowley that she was happy to elaborate on at length. He stood in the doorway for a moment taking in the scene. Martha looked up and said cheerfully, Your bride found the forged notation in the 1879 survey, which is more than your lawyer managed in 18 months, and I want to know why you didn't put a woman on this problem 2 years ago. Caleb looked at Eleanor. She looked back at him with an expression that was very carefully neutral, but something in her eyes was alive. Alert in a way he hadn't seen yet. Something that looked like it was enjoying itself. I didn't have a woman 2 years ago, he said. Well, you have one now, Martha said. I'd suggest using that fact. He looked at Eleanor a moment longer. She looked back, not waiting for his approval, just present, settled, like a woman who had found solid ground under her feet and recognized the sensation. I already am, he said, and Eleanor for the first time in 3 weeks let herself almost fully smile. That night after Martha had gone and supper was finished and the lamps were turned low, Caleb sat at the kitchen table alone and looked at the survey documents and thought about what he was doing. He was not a man who examined his own motivations very closely. He'd always found it more productive to watch what he did than to analyze why he did it. But tonight, something made him sit with the question. He'd brought a woman here because he needed a partner. That was the honest version. He'd been managing this ranch alone for 4 years, and the truth was that some things were slipping. Not the cattle, not the land, but the smaller things that accumulate when a person is stretched too thin. The accounts that needed a sharper eye. The decisions that needed someone to think them through with. The particular specific exhaustion of never having anyone to talk to at the end of the day about nothing in particular. He'd thought he was bringing home practical help. He had not thought he was bringing home someone like Eleanor Hart. He wasn't entirely sure yet what she was, or rather what she had been before whatever happened that she hadn't told him about yet. But he could read the outline of it. The careful movements. The way she cataloged exits in every room without seeming to. The lock she used every single night. The flinch she almost had and then controlled when he'd reached across the table for a document without warning early in the first week before she'd gotten used to him. He'd started automatically telegraphing his movements after that. Saying before he reached for something. Knocking before he came through a door, even in his own house. Leaving space between them when they walked together. It was the least he could do. It was nowhere near enough. Whatever happened to you, he thought looking at the lamp, you didn't deserve it. And you're not going to find it here. He didn't have a way to say that to her. Not yet. She'd run from words like that, he could tell. She needed to learn it from evidence, not promises. So he just kept going, one careful day after another, and trusted that eventually she'd believe what the evidence told her. He was a patient man. He'd wait as long as it took. The forged notation in the 1879 survey changed something between them, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a door changes when someone finally oils the hinge. It moves differently. More honestly, Caleb wrote to Helena the morning after Martha's visit. Eleanor watched him draft the letter at the kitchen table before breakfast, and she noticed the way he chose his words: specific, factual, nothing inflammatory. He wasn't a man who fought with his emotions when his mind could do the work more cleanly. "You should mention the surveyor's death record," she said from across the table. He looked up. "If you reference the 1883 death record directly in the letter, they'll have to pull it to verify." Once they're holding that document and the corrected survey side by side, anyone with basic training will see what I saw. He looked at what he'd written, crossed out a sentence, rewrote it the way she'd suggested. Then he looked up again with that particular expression she was starting to recognize, the one that meant he was filing something away. "You think like a lawyer," he said. "I was raised by one." A pause. "It gets in your head." "Is that a complaint?" "No," she said, and was slightly surprised to find she meant it. He sent Amos to town with the letter that morning. And then the waiting began, the specific grinding waiting that comes when you've made your move and have no choice but to let it travel at its own pace while the world continues to require your attention elsewhere. Life on the ranch didn't pause for legal correspondence. The south pasture fence needed 2 full days of work. There were cattle to move before the first hard frost. The equipment shed roof, which Caleb had been calling manageable since Eleanor arrived, finally made its opinion known during a 3-day rain that came in from the northwest and decided to conduct most of itself inside the building. Eleanor found out about the roof on the second morning of rain, when she came into the kitchen and found Caleb already in his coat at 6 in the morning, looking at the shed from the window with the expression of a man calculating how bad the damage was going to be before he had to go find out. "How long has it been like this?" she asked. "The leak since August. I kept patching the worst of it. And now I need to stop patching and fix it." He turned from the window. "Amos and I can manage it. It's going to take most of the week. I can help." He looked at her steadily. "Eleanor, I'm not going to put you on a roof in the rain." "I didn't say the roof. I said I can help." She held his gaze. "Show me what needs to be brought out and dried, what needs to be inventoried for damage, what records you keep in there that need to be protected. I can manage all of that while you and Amos handle the structure." He studied her for a moment, the way he had a habit of doing when she surprised him, not condescending about it, just genuinely recalibrating. Then he nodded. "All right, after breakfast." They worked in the rain all day. Not together exactly. He was on the roof with Amos while she worked below, but in the particular comfortable parallel of people who have figured out how to share a problem without getting in each other's way. She moved equipment, sorted what was salvageable, kept a running account of what needed replacement and what could wait. By midday, she had a list that was more organized than anything currently in his ranch ledger. When Caleb climbed down at noon and she handed him the inventory, he stood reading it in the rain for a full minute without saying anything. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He handed it back. "It's good. It's very good." He paused. "You counted the spare harness hardware separately." "Because the cost is different, and you'll want to know the replacement figure by category when you talk to the feed and supply man in town." "I will," he said. "I wouldn't have thought to break it down that way. My father had me keep his office accounts from the time I was 16. She rolled the papers to protect them from the rain. "He said numbers either tell the truth or tell a lie, and you have to know which one you're getting." Caleb looked at her for a moment with something that was quiet and direct and not easily named. "He taught you well," he said. "He tried." She looked away. "I was better at the numbers than at everything that came after." He didn't ask what that meant. He put his hat back on and went back up the roof. And Eleanor went back to her inventory, and the rain kept coming, and neither of them said anything else about it. but she'd said something she hadn't planned to. And the strange thing, the thing she turned over in her mind that evening with the lamp burning and the rain still tapping, was that saying it hadn't felt like losing ground. It had felt almost like the opposite. The letter from Helena came back in 11 days. Amos brought it from town on a Tuesday morning and set it on the kitchen table without ceremony, and Caleb looked at it for a moment before he picked it up with the expression of a man who has learned not to assume good news. Eleanor watched from the doorway. He opened it, read it again. His jaw tightened, then released, then went very still in the way that meant he was making himself be calm about something. "Well," she said. He set the letter on the table and turned it so she could read it. The county land records office in Helena had received his letter. They had reviewed the documents he referenced. They found his concerns. The letter used the word concerns with the particular careful neutrality of bureaucrats who hadn't decided yet which side of a situation was going to be more trouble to be worthy of further review. They were requesting the original survey documents be submitted in person by a duly authorized representative of the Dawson Ranch to the Helena office within 30 days. "That's not a refusal," Eleanor said. "It's not a confirmation either." "No, but it's not a dismissal." She read the letter again. They used the phrase duly authorized representative. That's specific legal language. They're opening a formal review process. They just need someone to appear in person to initiate it. "That's a 2-day ride to Helena." "I know." She set the letter down. "Your lawyer should go, or you should go yourself. If I leave the ranch for 5 days this close to winter, I can manage the ranch for 5 days," she said. He looked at her. "I've been here 6 weeks," she said steadily. "I know the routine. Amos is here. Martha is 30 minutes away if anything goes sideways." She held his gaze. "Go to Helena, Caleb. This matters." He was quiet for a long moment. "You'd be all right here alone." It wasn't quite a question. It was the careful version of one. "Yes," she said. And then, because she thought he deserved the honest version, "I'm better alone than I used to be. I feel safe here." The words came out slightly careful, like she'd tested their weight before committing to them. "That's not something I've been able to say in a long time." The kitchen went very quiet. Caleb looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something unguarded in it briefly before he pulled it back to steadiness. He nodded once. "I'll talk to Amos today," he said. "We'll plan the trip for next week." He left on a Wednesday. The morning was clear and cold, the first real cold of the season, and Amos had the horses ready before sunrise. Caleb came through the kitchen, took his coffee standing up, and checked without drawing attention to it that the kitchen supply of firewood was adequate, that Eleanor knew where the extra lamp oil was stored, that she had the list of what the cattle needed and when. She watched him check all of this with a kind of bemused steadiness. "I managed a household for 6 years," she said. "I'll be fine." "I know you will." He put his cup down. "I'm not checking because I don't think you can manage. I'm checking because—" He stopped, started again. "It's a habit. Making sure everything's in order before I leave. It's got nothing to do with you." She tilted her head slightly. "What was her name?" He went still. "Your wife," Eleanor said quietly. "You don't have to answer that." A pause. Then Sarah. "How long were you married?" 8 years. He looked at the cup. "She got sick in our 9th winter. Influenza. It went fast." He was quiet for a moment. "After that, I checked everything twice before I went anywhere. Like if I'd checked more carefully before I could have—" He stopped, let out a short breath. "I know that's not rational." "No," Eleanor said. "But grief isn't rational. It just is." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "No," he said. "It just is." They stood in the kitchen for a moment in that particular silence that happens when two people have told each other something real and don't know yet what to do with the weight of it. Then Caleb picked up his hat. I'll be back by Sunday, Monday at the latest. I'll have supper ready. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. I'll have it ready. He almost smiled. She was starting to recognize when he was almost smiling, the slight shift at the corner of his mouth, the way his eyes warmed a degree. It was a quieter version of what most men did, but it was more honest for being quiet. He went out the door. She listened to the horses leave. And then she stood in the silence of the ranch house and waited to feel afraid the way she always felt afraid when she was alone. It didn't come. What came instead was something she didn't have a word for yet. Something that felt like space, like room to breathe, like the particular strange relief of being somewhere safe enough that alone didn't mean dangerous. She turned back to the kitchen and started planning her week. She managed. More than managed. In the 5 days Caleb was gone, she reorganized the ranch accounts ledger in a way that would save him 3 hours every month. Repaired a stretch of fence in the near paddock that Amos had been meaning to get to, and spent 2 evenings with Martha Callahan, going through older county records that Martha had in her own possession from her late husband's dealings with the land office. Martha had, it turned out, very specific and well-documented reasons to dislike Victor Crowley that had nothing to do with Caleb's land dispute. He tried to move the boundary on my east pasture in 1884, Martha said, spreading papers across her kitchen table. Right after Henry died. I think he expected a widow alone to be easier to deal with than a man. Was he right? Eleanor asked. Martha gave her a look. What do you think? I think he miscalculated. I had the county surveyor out 3 times, Martha said. Cost me more than I could easily afford. But by the time we were done, there wasn't a judge in the territory who'd have touched my east pasture. She paused. I kept all the documents. Every single one. Eleanor looked at the papers Martha had spread across the table. May I? That's why I got them out. Eleanor started reading. 20 minutes in, she found it a county filing receipt from 1884, stamped with a notation from the Land Records Office counter, signed by the county official on duty. The signature was Crowley's, and the date was 6 weeks before he had claimed in his current challenge to Caleb's deed that he first became aware of irregularities in the eastern parcel surveys, which meant Crowley had known about that parcel, had personally handled documents related to it years before he claimed to have noticed a problem, which meant his claim of a neutral administrative finding was a lie. Martha, Eleanor said. The older woman came to look over her shoulder. He signed off on boundary documents in this county in 1884, Eleanor said. He had direct knowledge of the survey records at that time. Martha was quiet for a moment. He's been planning this for years, she said. Or the opportunity just presented itself and he's been maneuvering since. Eleanor looked at the signature. Either way, this receipt puts him in direct contact with those records before his stated timeline. She carefully set the document aside. I need to bring this to Caleb when he gets back. Take it, Martha said simply. I have no use for it except to help. Eleanor looked at her. You've been waiting for someone to find a use for these papers. Martha met her eyes directly. I've been waiting for someone to fight him properly, she said. Henry would have, but Henry is gone. She paused. You fight well, Eleanor. The words landed somewhere soft, somewhere she didn't usually let words land. I haven't had much occasion to fight for something worth keeping before, Eleanor said quietly. Martha reached over and pressed her hand once briefly. Said nothing. Didn't need to. Caleb came back on Sunday evening, which was the earlier estimate, which told Eleanor that Helena had gone well before he said a single word. She could read it in the way he came through the door, not the tight, controlled, careful way he moved when things were uncertain, but something easier, like a man who'd set down something heavy and hadn't picked it back up yet. The Helena office is opening a formal review, he said, taking off his coat. They're sending their own surveyor, independent of the county office. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. When? 3 weeks, maybe 4. He looked at her. They took the documents. They'll run the comparison themselves. Good. She turned back to the stove. Sit down, supper's ready. He sat. She brought the food. And then, when she sat down across from him, she slid Martha's document across the table. He looked at it, looked at the date, looked at the signature. His expression went through several things in quick succession: recognition, then a cold anger that he visibly controlled, then a kind of grim satisfaction. Martha Callahan had this, Eleanor said, from 1884. He signed county records that included the Eastern Parcel Survey documents 6 years ago, before his stated discovery date. This proves he knew. It proves he had access to the records. Proving intent is harder, but this puts him in direct contradiction of his own filed timeline. She met Caleb's eyes. If the Helena surveyor finds the forgery in the notation, and we submit this receipt alongside it, we have 2 separate lines of evidence pointing to the same conclusion. Caleb looked at her across the table for a long moment. "You did this while I was gone," he said. It wasn't a question. "Martha found the document. I just read it. Eleanor." His voice was careful, deliberate. "You could have spent those 5 days doing nothing but keeping the ranch ticking over, and that would have been more than enough. No one would have. I wouldn't have expected." "I know you wouldn't have expected it," she said. "That's not why I did it." "Then why?" She was quiet for a moment, longer than she'd intended. Something moved in her chest that she didn't entirely trust, and she worked to keep her voice level when she answered. "Because this ranch is worth protecting," she said. "Because Crowley is the kind of man who does what he does because he believes that people with less power than him can't fight back effectively." She paused. "I've lived around men like that. I'm tired of them being right." The table was very quiet. Caleb looked at her with something open in his face, something he wasn't trying to conceal. "He wasn't right this time," he said. "No," she said. "He wasn't." They ate in the particular comfortable quiet of 2 people who have said something that mattered and don't need to say more to make it count. 3 days later, Crowley came to the ranch himself. Eleanor was in the barn when she heard the wagon. She came out and recognized him before she was introduced, not because she'd seen him before, but because she'd known men shaped like him her whole life. The particular way power settled on a man who'd never had it questioned. The way he looked at the property when he pulled in, not with curiosity, but with the flat proprietary assessment of someone who already considered it half his. He was 50, broad-shouldered, well-dressed for a county official in a way that signaled money from somewhere other than his salary. He climbed down from his wagon with the easy authority of a man who expected space to be made for him. Caleb came out of the house. "Dawson," Crowley said, "I heard you sent documents to Helena." "I did." Caleb's voice was perfectly level. "That's my right." "Of course it is." Crowley smiled with his mouth. "I just wanted to come by personally, make sure there wasn't some misunderstanding driving all this. These things have a way of getting complicated when they don't have to be." "What kind of misunderstanding did you have in mind?" Crowley spread his hands. "Reasonable man. Generous man. The survey correction is a standard administrative finding. These things happen with old records. No one's trying to take anything from anyone." A pause. He looked at Eleanor for the first time directly, with an assessment that took her apart and put her back together in about 3 seconds flat. "This, your new bride. This is Eleanor Dawson," Caleb said. He used the name deliberately. Eleanor noticed that. Crowley smiled at her. "Boston," someone said. "Long way from home." "Montana is my home now," she said. He kept smiling. "Must be quite an adjustment." A beat. Something shifted in his expression, something that was calculating itself very quickly. "Caleb, I wonder if we might speak privately." "Anything you want to say to me can be said in front of my wife." Crowley looked between them. The smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. "Of course," he said pleasantly. "I was just going to say this review process in Helena tends to run long. It's a lot of time and expense for something that could be resolved simply. I've been authorized to offer a fair market price for the eastern parcel. Clean transaction. No dispute, no review process, no lawyers involved." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. The eastern parcel is not for sale, he said. Everything's for sale at the right price. Not that parcel. Caleb's voice hadn't changed in volume or heat, just settled deeper like something bedding down for a long stay. And I think you know why. Crowley held his gaze. Behind the pleasant expression, Eleanor could see the calculation running how hard to push what angle was left to try, whether there was something in the situation he hadn't yet leveraged. His eyes moved to her again. Stayed there a beat too long. He's going to come at this from another direction, she thought. He's already decided what the other direction is. She met his gaze steadily and said nothing. She'd had a great deal of practice not flinching under the specific kind of look that was trying to find a weak spot. Crowley said pleasantly, "Well, the offer stands. I hope the review process goes smoothly." He put his hat back on. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Dawson." He climbed back into his wagon and left. Eleanor waited until the sound of the wheels had faded completely. Then she said very quietly, "He's going to look into my past." Caleb turned to look at her. "That look he gave me," she said. "He's already decided I'm the angle." She kept her voice even, factual. Whatever he finds is going to depend on how deep he digs and who he talks to. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Is there something he could find? She met his eyes. "That depends," she said carefully, "on whose version of events he gets to first." The space between those words was enormous. She could feel it. The thing she hadn't told him yet, pressing against the inside of everything she'd said and done for the last 6 weeks. The truth that had followed her 2,000 miles and was now apparently going to follow her here too. "Eleanor," Caleb said, in the same voice he used when he was about to say something that mattered and wanted to make sure it landed right. "Whatever it is, when you're ready." She looked at him. The wind picked up across the yard, cold and clean and direct. "I know," she said. But her hands down at her sides had gone quiet and still in the way they went still when she was holding herself together from the inside out, and Caleb saw that, and said nothing, and stood there beside her in the cold while the last sound of Crowley's wagon disappeared into the distance, because sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply refuse to leave. Crowley didn't come back. That was almost worse. A man who came back, you could watch. A man who went quiet and stayed quiet was working somewhere you couldn't see, building something you wouldn't know about until it was already standing in front of you. Eleanor knew this the way she knew certain other things, not from reading about it, but from having lived it. From 6 years of learning that the most dangerous moment in a room was not when a man raised his voice. It was when he stopped. She went about the ranch work the way she always did, methodical and steady, but something underneath had shifted into a higher alertness. She found herself listening differently, watching Amos when he came back from town for any change in how he looked at her, noticing when the mail came and what Caleb's face did when he read it. He noticed her noticing. Of course he did. 4 days after Crowley's visit, he came in from the north pasture at midday and found her at the kitchen table with the land documents spread out again, cross-referencing dates, and he sat down across from her and said without preamble, "Tell me what you're looking for." Another line of connection between Crowley and the original surveyor's estate. If the surveyor died in 1883 and Crowley's office filed the corrected survey in 1885, someone had to have access to the original field notes to copy the notation style. That access had to come from somewhere. The surveyor's estate would have gone to his family, or to the county office if he had no family, and the records were considered official property. She looked up. "Do you know anything about him, James Whitfield? That's the name on the original documents?" Caleb thought for a moment. "There was a Whitfield family out near Glendale. I don't know if they're related. Is there anyone who would know? Martha might. Or Reverend Cole in town. He's been here 30 years and knows every family history in the county." A pause. "Eleanor." His voice changed slightly, got that careful quality. "You don't have to run yourself ragged on this." "I'm not running myself ragged. I'm thinking." She met his eyes. Thinking keeps me from doing the other thing. What other thing? She looked back at the documents. Waiting for something bad to happen, she said quietly. I've spent a lot of my life waiting for the next bad thing. Work gives me somewhere else to put my attention. He was quiet for a long moment. I'll ride out to Reverend Cole tomorrow morning, he said. You want to come? She looked up again, slightly surprised. 2 sets of ears, he said simply. And you'll know which questions to ask. She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her chest did that thing it had been doing with increasing frequency, that shift, that slight giving way, like ice that has been cold so long, it's forgotten, it's capable of anything else. And then one warm day arrives, and the surface begins to change. Yes, she said. I'll come. Reverend Cole turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed man of about 65, who kept meticulous records and had opinions about virtually everything that had occurred in Cutter County since 1857. He received them in the front room of the parsonage and had coffee on the table before Eleanor had finished taking off her coat. And then he looked at her with the bright, calculating interest of a man who collects people the way others collect coins. James Whitfield, he said when Caleb asked. Of course I knew him. Good surveyor, methodical, came to church every third Sunday, which in my experience means a man with a conscience, but not an excess of it. A pause. He died of a fever in the autumn of '83, unmarried, no children. What happened to his records? Eleanor asked. Cole looked at her approvingly, the way a teacher looks at a student who has asked the right question. His personal effects went to a nephew in Billings. His professional records, field notes, equipment, working documents, those were classified as county property and taken by the Land Records Office. He paused deliberately. Signed for by the county official on duty at the time. Eleanor felt it before he said the name. The specific cold certainty of a thing falling into place. Victor Crowley, she said. Cole looked at her over his coffee cup. You did your reading? He said. Martha Callahan had records from 1884. Crowley's signature appeared on county filings around that time. She kept her voice level. He took possession of Whitfield's professional records personally. He did. Cole set down his cup. I thought it was irregular at the time. Said so to the county board. Was told it was standard administrative procedure. He paused. I wrote it down. I write everything down. Caleb looked at the Reverend very carefully. Do you still have that record? Cole stood up without another word and went to a cabinet in the corner of the room. He came back with a ledger, the kind that churches use for membership and event records, and opened it to a page from October 1883. He turned it and slid it across the table. Eleanor read it. The entry was brief and precise, a notation that James Whitfield's county survey records had been removed from the records office on the 14th of October by V. Crowley County land official without formal transfer documentation against the concern of this witness. Caleb read it over her shoulder. His breath went out slowly. Will you attest to this? Eleanor asked Cole. Formally, if there's a review hearing. Cole looked at her with steady, clear eyes. Young woman, he said, I have been waiting 8 years for someone to ask me that question. They rode back to the ranch in a silence that had texture to it, full and fast-moving, the silence of 2 people processing the same information from different angles simultaneously. Eleanor's mind was already 3 moves ahead, assembling the evidentiary sequence, the order in which documents needed to be presented, the way the Helena surveyor's findings would need to align with the timeline they were building. Caleb spoke first, and what he said wasn't about the legal case at all. You're good at this, he said. She glanced at him. I told you my father taught me. It's more than that. You know how to talk to people, how to ask questions without making them feel interrogated. A pause. Cole was ready to give us everything in the first 30 seconds of talking to you. He wouldn't have done that for a lawyer. He'd made up his mind before we arrived, Eleanor said. He just needed a reason to open the cabinet. You gave him the reason. She was quiet for a moment. The horse moved under her steadily, and the cold air was clean and flat, and smelled like the coming winter. I used to have to be very careful about how I asked for things, she said finally. Learning to phrase a question so it couldn't be turned against you, that was survival, not skill. The words dropped into the quiet between them, and neither of them moved to fill the space immediately. Eleanor, he said. I know. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. I know you haven't pushed. I know you've been patient. The word came out slightly unsteady. I'm not good at this, at explaining things, at knowing where to start. You don't have to start anywhere today. I know that too. A long pause. That's actually the problem. Every day you don't push, it gets harder to find a reason to keep it all locked up. And I'm used to having a reason. Having something to protect. Caleb was quiet, letting her find her own way through it. His name was Gerald Hart, she said. I took his name when we married, and I've kept it because it's the one that's on my travel documents, and I didn't see the need to explain the story to an agency. She paused. That's the first lie. There are a few others that aren't exactly lies, but aren't the full truth either. All right, Caleb said. You're not going to ask what they are. Not on a cold road in November, no. She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead, his profile steady and unremarkable against the gray sky, and she thought, this is what a patient man actually looks like. Not passive, not weak, just genuinely at peace with waiting for something real. Tonight, she said. After supper, I'll tell you. Only if you want to. I want to, she said. I want to before Crowley's version gets there first. Yeah, she told him after supper. She didn't plan how to start. She'd spent 6 weeks finding reasons to delay, and the reasons had run out, and so she simply sat across from him at the cleared kitchen table, with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and began at the beginning, which was a dinner party in Boston in 1878, when she was 19 years old, and Gerald Hart had looked at her across a room with the specific focused attention that she had not yet learned to recognize as a warning sign. She told him about the courtship, which had been swift and convincing, and full of the kinds of gestures that look like devotion from the outside. She told him about her father's approval, which had meant everything to her at 19, and had not outlived the first year of the marriage. She told him about the way things changed, not all at once, never all at once, but the way a room gets dark so gradually that you don't quite notice when you stopped being able to see clearly. She told him about the first time Gerald hit her. She told him what she'd told herself after that it was an accident, that he'd been under strain, that she must have said something wrong, that she needed to be more careful. She told him how long she'd believed those things, and how much evidence had been required to finally stop believing them. She told him about the stairs. October 1884. The argument about money, or what started as an argument about money, which became an argument about everything else that had been building for 3 years, and the way Gerald's face had gone past anger into something flat and decided, and her own back hitting the railing, and then the fall. She stopped. Her hands tightened on the coffee cup. Caleb didn't move, didn't make a sound, just present, solid, utterly still. I was in hospital for 2 weeks, she said. Broken ribs, my left shoulder, other things. She paused. Gerald told everyone I had slipped. Everyone believed him. He was good at being believed. She told him about the months after the stairs. The way she'd finally methodically understood that the next time would kill her, not because she knew Gerald consciously planned it, but because the trajectory of things had a direction, and she could finally read it clearly. She told him about her father's old law partner, who had helped her quietly access a small trust her father had left that Gerald hadn't been able to touch. She told him about the night she left. She told him about Gerald's death, 8 months after she'd left, a riding accident outside Boston. She told him that she hadn't grieved, and that not grieving had been its own kind of weight to carry. She told him that there had been questions afterward. Some of Gerald's family had raised them quietly, implications that her leaving and his death were not unconnected events. There was never any formal accusation, she said. Nothing was ever filed, but the questions existed. They still exist. If Crowley digs into Boston records and talks to the right people... She stopped. The wrong people. She looked up from the cup and met Caleb's eyes for the first time in a long while. That's what he'll find. A widow who left her husband and whose husband died shortly after. That's the version that can be made to look like something it isn't. The silence in the kitchen was total. Caleb looked at her for a long, steady moment. His face was not shocked. It was not pulling away into judgment or suspicion. It was concentrated, like a man who has been given something important and is making sure he holds it correctly. "How long?" he said quietly. "Have you been carrying all of that by yourself?" The question hit her in a place she hadn't known was still exposed. Not "did you do it?" Not "how do I know you're telling the truth?" Not "this changes things." Not any of the questions she had spent years dreading, that she had rehearsed answers to in her sleep, that she had braced for every day since leaving Boston. Just how long have you been carrying all of that by yourself? Like the weight of it was the thing that mattered. Like the duration of the carrying was something he found genuinely unbearable to think about. The walls she had built, the ones made of careful words, and measured distances, and locked doors, and deliberately unrevealing answers to questions nobody asked directly. They didn't fall slowly. They didn't crumble. They simply failed. All at once. Like a structure that had been held up entirely by tension, and the tension just released. Eleanor cried, not quietly the way she'd cried before in her life. Controlled private something to be finished before anyone could see it and use it against her. She cried the way a person cries when they have not cried honestly in years, and the body has decided it will no longer cooperate with the pretense that everything is fine. Great, wrenching, uncontrolled, ugly crying that she could not have stopped if she had tried. She didn't try. Caleb didn't move to her immediately. He didn't rush around the table to fix it. He sat very still for a moment, giving her the first few seconds of it, because those seconds belonged to her. And then he stood and came around the table and crouched down beside her chair, so he was not above her, not looming over her, and he put his hand over hers on the table, just his hand over hers, and he said nothing at all. Not one word. And that was exactly, precisely, perfectly right. She cried until it ran out. It took a while. When it finally did, she was wrung out and slightly embarrassed, and entirely unable to care about the embarrassment, which was itself a strange new sensation. She looked at him. His hand was still over hers. "I don't do that," she said hoarsely. I haven't." "I know," he said. "I don't want you to think, Eleanor." His voice was very quiet, very certain. "I think you survived something that would have destroyed most people. I think you made it across 2,000 miles alone on the strength of sheer will. And I think you've been holding yourself together with both hands for so long that you forgot you don't have to do it by yourself anymore." She stared at him. "Whatever Crowley finds," he said, "whatever version he brings to whatever room, I know who you are. I've been watching who you are for 6 weeks." His hand pressed slightly over hers. "Nobody is going to use your past against you while I'm standing. That's not a promise I'll break." She had to look away. The directness of it was almost too much. She'd spent so long being seen in ways that hurt, that being seen in a way that didn't, it had its own particular, unbearable quality. "You don't know me well enough to promise that," she said. "I know you well enough," he said simply. She looked back at him. His eyes were steady and brown and completely without qualification. "I found the forged notation in an hour," she said. "You noticed." "I noticed." "Your neighbors brought evidence to help you without being asked because they trust you. You noticed that too." She swallowed. "A man who builds that kind of trust doesn't do it by accident." "I try to do right by people," he said. "That's all." "That's not a small thing," she said. "You'd be surprised how small a thing it seems to most people." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face that he didn't reach for words to describe. He just held her hand on the table, in the warm light of the kitchen, and outside the wind had come up and was moving around the house, and the fire in the stove was doing what fires do when they've been well built and properly tended. "Crowley is going to come at this hard," she said finally. Her voice was steadier now. Something had set in it, some new quality, not hard exactly, but resolved, like a person who has put down a weight and picked up a tool instead. He's going to dig into Boston records and find the questions Gerald's family raised, and he's going to bring them here and make them as loud as possible. Yes, Caleb said. He will. We have to be ahead of it. We need to document what we have before he files anything. The coal entry, Martha's receipt, the notation comparison, everything goes to Helena, and it goes before he has a chance to muddy the water with my history. Caleb looked at her carefully. You're ready to do that? She met his eyes. I'm done running, she said. I've been running for 3 years. I'm tired, Caleb. I'm so tired of running. A pause. This is the first place I've had that's worth stopping for. The words hung in the air between them, weightless and enormous at the same time. He stood slowly and went to put more wood in the stove because he was a man who needed to do something with his hands when something moved him, and he didn't want to make it uncomfortable for either of them. She understood that and was grateful for it. When he came back to the table, he sat down and pulled the land documents toward them both. Show me the order you'd present these, he said, start to finish. She looked at him. Now, you said we need to be ahead of it. A pause. The corner of his mouth shifted. So let's get ahead of it. She almost laughed. Something lighter than she'd felt in years moved through her chest, precarious and new and entirely real. She pulled the documents toward her and started talking, and Caleb sat across from her and listened with his whole attention, and the lamp burned warm between them, and outside the first true snow of winter began to fall on the Montana Valley, quiet and absolute, covering everything in the kind of clean white that makes the world look the way it did before. Whatever happened to it happened. 2 days later, Amos came back from town with a letter and a look on his face that said the letter was not good news before he handed it over. Caleb read it. His jaw went tight. He handed it to Eleanor without a word. It was from a lawyer in Billings, not one Caleb knew. The letter stated that his client, Victor Crowley, had become aware of information regarding the personal history of Eleanor Hart, formerly Eleanor Whitmore of Boston, Massachusetts, and that this information was material to the ongoing question of the Dawson Ranch's legitimacy of title insofar as questions regarding Mrs. Dawson's character and past conduct were relevant to the credibility of documents she had submitted in support of the title review. Eleanor read it twice. Her face didn't change. He found something in Boston, Caleb said. He found the questions Gerald's family raised, or someone found them for him. She set the letter on the table. He's going to argue that my testimony and the documents I identified are compromised by my personal history. That's not how evidence law works. No, but it doesn't have to be how the law works to be how public opinion works. She looked at him steadily. He's not going to court first. He's going to come at the community first, at the county board, at the people who will be in that hearing room. A pause. This is a warning shot. Then we need to move faster. Yes. She folded the letter precisely. Write to the Helena office today. Tell them we have additional testimony from a long-term county resident with direct documented evidence of Crowley's access to the original survey records. Tell them we're prepared to submit everything within the week. She looked up. And Caleb. Tell Martha. Martha. Crowley is going to start talking. Martha knows every family in this valley. She was here before Crowley had any power at all. Eleanor's voice was clear and direct and absolutely certain. Let her talk first. Caleb looked at her across the table. You trust her, he said. I trust what I've seen, Eleanor said. And what I've seen is a woman who's been waiting 8 years to fight this man properly. She met his eyes. Let's not make her wait any longer. Martha moved fast. That was the thing about Martha Callahan that Eleanor had understood intellectually, but hadn't fully seen in action. Until now, the woman did not deliberate once she'd made up her mind. Caleb rode out to her place on Wednesday morning to tell her what Crowley's lawyer had sent. By Wednesday evening, Martha had already spoken to 4 families in the valley. By Thursday noon, she had spoken to 11, Eleanor found this out when Amos came back from the feed store in town and reported with the particular satisfied expression of a man who has heard good news and is trying not to look too pleased about it, that 3 separate ranchers had approached him unprompted to say they'd heard about Crowley's letter. And they didn't think much of a man who went digging into a woman's private history to win a land argument. Eleanor was at the kitchen table when Amos reported this. She sat very still for a moment. "They said that," she said. "Pete Garland said it was low behavior, his words." Amos pulled off his coat. "Tom Briggs asked if there was anything you needed. His wife wants to come by if you're receiving visitors." She looked down at the documents in front of her. Her throat was doing something she didn't have a ready explanation for. Caleb came in from the barn and read Amos's expression accurately. "What happened?" "Valley's talking," Amos said. "And from what I can tell, it's not talking Crowley's direction." Caleb looked at Eleanor. She looked back at him. Something passed between them that didn't need words, a shared understanding that what Martha had started was real and moving and wasn't going to stop on its own. "We need to get everything to Helena before the end of the week," Eleanor said. "Whatever Crowley's lawyer does next, we need to already be on record." "I'll ride out tomorrow," Caleb said. "First light." "I'm coming with you." He started to say something, and then didn't. He'd learned in the past weeks that the occasions when Eleanor said "I'm coming" in that particular tone were not occasions for debate. He simply nodded. "First light," he said. "Get some sleep." She almost told him she wouldn't sleep anyway. But she didn't because she knew he knew, and saying it out loud would just be spending words on something they both already understood. They left before dawn with the documents in a leather case that Caleb had oiled and double-sealed against the weather. The ride to Helena was long and cold, and they talked more than they ever had. Not about the case, not about Crowley, but about other things. About her father's practice, the cases she'd watched him argue. About the ranch in Pennsylvania, where she'd spent her summers, and the uncle who'd taught her that work done well was its own reward, and not to wait for someone else to say so. Caleb talked too more than was his habit. About his father who'd built the ranch from a single claim and a borrowed wagon, and a stubbornness that had been by all accounts genuinely alarming to everyone who encountered it. About Sarah briefly, in the careful way he talked about her, not with grief, exactly, more with the careful respect of someone honoring a room that is no longer occupied. "Did you think you'd marry again?" Eleanor asked. She asked it directly because she'd found that with Caleb, directness was always better than circling. "I didn't think much about it either way," he said. "Amos started mentioning it about 2 years in. I told him to mind his own operation." A pause. He mentioned it again 6 months later, and then every few months after that. Persistent, like a loose board you keep meaning to fix. A beat. "I wrote to the agency because he was right, and I was tired of him being right and not being able to say so." Eleanor looked at him. "And when you met me?" "When I met you," he said. "I thought this woman has a story she's not going to tell me easily." A pause. "I thought that was all right. I had time." "You weren't disappointed that I wasn't easier?" He looked at her sideways. "Easier how? Simpler? Less?" She stopped. "Less carrying things." "Eleanor," he said, and his voice had that quality it got when he was about to say something plain and true and wasn't going to dress it up. A woman who doesn't carry anything hasn't lived long enough to be interesting. He looked back at the road. "I'm 36 years old. I don't need easy. I need honest." She faced forward and let the cold air do what it did, which was clear everything out and leave only what was actually real. "I'm working on honest," she said. "You're better at it than you think," he said. And that was the end of that conversation, because he meant it and didn't feel the need to elaborate, and she believed him and didn't need him to. The Helena Land Records Office was a low stone building that smelled like paper and lamp oil, and the particular mustiness of documents that had been sitting in drawers for decades undisturbed. The clerk at the front desk was a young man with a careful manner who looked at Caleb's name on the letter and went immediately to find his supervisor without being asked, which told Eleanor that they were expected and that someone in this office had been paying attention. The supervisor was a woman named Agnes Holt, which surprised Eleanor and apparently didn't surprise Caleb at all. She was somewhere in her 50s, compact and efficient, with the kind of face that processed information the way a good clock processes time steadily without making a production of it. She brought them to a back office and sat across a wide desk and looked at Eleanor with the particular direct assessment of a woman who has been in a room full of men for 30 years and has learned to read another woman's situation quickly. "Mrs. Dawson," she said, "I read your husband's letter carefully. The notation discrepancy you identified in the 1879 survey, were you the one who found it?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "What's your background?" "My father was a land attorney in Boston. I read documents in his office from the age of 14. She kept her voice level and factual. "I also have 2 additional pieces of evidence I'd like to submit today if the office is prepared to receive them." Agnes Holt looked at the leather case. "Let me see them." Eleanor opened the case. She laid out the documents in the order she'd planned on the ride up the Reverend Cole's ledger entry first, then Martha's 1884 filing receipt with Crowley's signature, then the side-by-side comparison of the 2 survey notations she'd prepared on clean paper with her annotations. Agnes Holt read them in sequence without speaking. She read slowly and carefully, the way Eleanor had learned to read for pattern, for what broke from pattern, for where the story, the documents told, didn't match the story someone was trying to make them tell. When she finished, she looked up. "The Cole attestation," she said. "He's prepared to appear formally." "He said he'd been waiting 8 years to be asked," Eleanor said. Something moved in Agnes Holt's expression, not quite a smile, but close to it. "The Crowley office filed a complaint with this office yesterday," she said, "regarding the credibility of documents submitted in support of the Dawson title review. Specifically, questions were raised about the personal history of the submitting party." "Me," Eleanor said. "Yes." Holt looked at her steadily. "I want you to know that this office evaluates documents on the basis of their content and the verifiability of their provenance, not on the personal history of whoever identified them." The relief was physical. Eleanor felt it in her shoulders, in the loosening of something she'd been holding tight since Crowley's lawyer's letter arrived. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. The law is what it is." Holt gathered the documents precisely. "I'm going to enter all of this into the formal record today. Our surveyor goes out to the Dawson property next Tuesday. If his findings align with what you've documented here—" She paused. "Crowley's challenge doesn't have a leg to stand on." Caleb, who had been quiet through most of this, said, "And if he tries to escalate through the county board before Tuesday?" Holt looked at him. "Then he'll find that the territorial office outranks the county board, and that we've already opened a formal review, and that interfering with that process carries consequences he will not enjoy." She stood. "Mr. Dawson, Mrs. Dawson, I'll be in touch by the end of next week." They shook hands and left. In the street outside, the cold bit hard, and the sky was the particular flat white of a day considering snow. Eleanor stood for a moment and breathed it in. "She's going to hold," she said. "Yes," Caleb agreed. "Crowley is going to push hard between now and Tuesday." "He will." A pause. "Let him." She looked at him. There was something different in his face today than what she was used to, a quieter kind of certainty, like a man who has looked at the cards on the table and understood he has what he needs to play the hand. "You're not worried," she said. It came out almost like an accusation. "I'm not worried," he said. "But I've got a forged document, a witness who's been sitting on 8 years of testimony, a neighbor with a paper trail, and a wife who can read a land record faster than any lawyer I've ever met." He looked at her. "What exactly is there left to worry about?" She stared at him. "You called me your wife. You are my wife. You've never... you've said Mrs. Dawson, but you haven't. Eleanor." He said her name with the patience of a man who has figured out that she needs to hear things plainly, or she won't hear them at all. "You are my wife, not a contract, Not an arrangement. Mine. A beat. And I intend to make sure Crowley understands that when he goes looking for a weak spot, he's going to find that there isn't one. She stood in the cold street in Helena, Montana, and looked at this man she had married 6 weeks ago on paper and somewhat longer ago in practice, and she thought I came 2,000 miles to find something I couldn't have named when I left. And I found it. And I am not going to waste it by being afraid of it. All right, she said. All right. All right, she said again. And this time there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before, something settled and decided, and not going anywhere. Let's go home. Doug. The Tuesday surveyor came and went in 4 hours and said nothing to anyone except that his report would be submitted to the Helena office within 5 business days. This was the kind of answer that told you nothing specific and told you everything general, and Eleanor chose to read it as a good sign because she had looked the man in the eye when he arrived, and he had the specific expression of someone who already understood what he was going to find before he found it. Crowley did push exactly as Eleanor had predicted. By Thursday of that week, he had spoken to 3 members of the county board and submitted a formal objection to the Helena review process on procedural grounds, arguing that the territorial office had exceeded its jurisdiction. He had also, and this was the part that arrived in the form of a terse message from his Billings lawyer, filed a request with the Boston Court of Records for documentation related to the death of Gerald Whitmore Hart and the questions surrounding the circumstances. Caleb read this at the kitchen table on Thursday evening with Eleanor sitting across from him, and he read it without expression. And then he set it down and said, "How bad can it get?" The Boston questions were never formal, she said. There was no inquest, no charges. There is no official record of accusation, because no official accusation was ever made. She kept her voice steady. What he'll get is letters, gossip from Gerald's family, nothing that would stand up to formal scrutiny, but enough to create noise. Enough to create noise, she confirmed, in a community that doesn't know me well. They looked at each other across the table. Martha, they said at the same time. Caleb almost smiled. Eleanor almost did too. I'll ride out tomorrow morning, he said. I'll come. I know, he said, and didn't argue. Tued, Martha Callahan did not take the news of Crowley's Boston inquiry quietly. She took it with a particular kind of controlled fury that Eleanor had not yet seen from her, not loud, not scattered, but focused and cold and moving at speed. He is not going to bring Boston gossip into this valley and let it sit, Martha said. Not while I'm breathing. Martha, Eleanor said carefully, I need you to know what he might find, what he might say. She looked at the older woman steadily. Gerald died 8 months after I left. His family asked questions. Nothing was ever formal, but the questions exist. Martha looked at her for a long moment. Did you have anything to do with his death? No, I know that, Martha said without missing a beat. I'm asking because I want to hear you say it plainly, so I can repeat it plainly when someone asks me. Eleanor blinked. No, she said again. He died in a riding accident. I was in Philadelphia when it happened. I have a hotel receipt that proves it. Do you have that receipt? In my belongings, yes. Good. Martha turned to Caleb. Get her a lawyer. Not your land lawyer, a different one. Someone who handles personal matters. If Crowley's people are going in that direction, Eleanor needs counsel of her own separate from the land case. Caleb looked at Eleanor. She's right. I know she's right, Eleanor said. I know a name. My father's partner in Boston, James Whitmore. He's semi-retired, but he still practices. He knows my history better than anyone. If I write to him today and explain what's happening, he can prepare a formal attestation of the circumstances of Gerald's death and my whereabouts. Write it today, Martha said. Right now. I'll wait. Eleanor looked at her. You're staying. I'm not leaving until that letter is in Amos's hands ready for the morning mail. Martha sat down in the kitchen chair with the absolute finality of a woman who has decided where she is and has no intention of being elsewhere. Go get paper. Eleanor went and got paper. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote to James Whitmore for the first time in 3 years and told him everything briefly and factually, the way her father had always said to write a letter that might become a legal document. No emotion, all fact, every date correct, nothing left ambiguous. She told him what Crowley was looking for. She told him what she needed him to provide. She told him she was sorry to put this burden on him. She didn't tell him she was happy. She'd write that letter separately later when this was done. But writing this one, this specific factual "here is what I need" letter, she felt something she recognized distantly as herself. The part of herself that her father had trained and Gerald had tried to silence, and Montana was gradually bringing back to surface. She sealed the letter and handed it to Amos and watched him ride out with it. "Now what?" she said. "Now." Martha said, pouring herself more coffee, like she lived there. "We wait for the Helena report, and we make sure that when Crowley starts making noise in this county, there are enough people who know the real story to make the noise fall flat." She looked at Eleanor directly. "There are 15 families in this valley who have reasons of their own to see Crowley's power reduced. I've spent the last week reminding them of those reasons." She paused. "You are not fighting this alone. I want to be clear about that." Eleanor sat down slowly. The weight of those words, "you are not fighting this alone," settled into her in a way that was physical, like warmth after cold. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing this? You barely know me." Martha set down her cup and looked at Eleanor with those clear, direct eyes. "Because I remember what it was like to be new in this valley," she said. "I came here from Ohio 30 years ago with Henry and a wagon and no idea what I was doing. And the first woman who came to my door brought a pot of soup and told me which families were worth knowing and which ones would smile to my face and gossip behind my back. That woman has been dead for 12 years. She paused. "I've been paying that debt ever since." Eleanor looked at her. She had nothing adequate to say. She knew she didn't, and Martha knew she knew it, and so Martha just nodded once, and they sat with it in a comfortable silence. Caleb, who had been standing in the doorway listening, said, "I'll put the coffee on again." "Good man," Martha said. Poet. The Helena report came on a Friday morning 9 days after the surveyor's visit. Amos rode hard from town with it, and Eleanor heard him coming from inside the house and was already at the door when he reached the yard. He climbed down and handed her the envelope with a face that told her exactly nothing, which she'd learned was Amos's particular way of having feelings about things. He locked them down so completely that the total absence of expression was itself an expression. She took the envelope and went inside and set it on the table and stood looking at it for a full 30 seconds. Then Caleb came in from the barn and saw her standing there. "Is that it?" he said. "Yes." He came and stood beside her, not reaching for it, not telling her to open it, just standing beside her the way he had in the yard the day Crowley came present, solid, refusing to be elsewhere. She opened it. The report was 6 pages. She read the first paragraph, and then she had to stop and read it again to make sure she'd understood it correctly. The Helena Territorial Surveyor had found upon examination of both the original 1879 survey and the corrected survey filed by the Cutter County Land Records Office in 1885 that the corrected survey had been produced by a hand other than that of the original surveyor, James Whitfield, deceased 1883. The notation discrepancy was confirmed. The correction was deemed fraudulent. The original survey boundaries were recommended for reinstatement. Furthermore, given the evidence of direct access to the original survey records by the county land official at the time of Whitfield's death, the office was referring the matter to the Territorial Attorney General for investigation into potential abuse of official authority. Eleanor set the report on the table. "They're referring it to the Attorney General," she said. Caleb read the line himself. Something crossed his face, not triumph, something quieter and deeper than that. The expression of a man who has been holding a weight for a long time and has just been told he can set it down. "It's over," he said. "The land part is over," Eleanor said. "Crowley still has the Boston inquiry. Without the land case to anchor it, his lawyer drops it." Caleb looked at her. He was using your past as leverage on the property dispute. Without the property dispute, he has no reason to spend money pursuing a personal attack that has no legal object. She stood with that for a moment, turned it over, let herself actually believe it. He's going to lose his position, she said. Attorney General gets involved, yes, probably. Caleb paused. He made enemies doing this, not just us. Half this county has a complaint against Crowley they've been sitting on for years. Once the Attorney General opens a file, he stopped. Those people will talk. Martha's people. Martha's people. He looked at her. You told me to let Martha talk first. I did. You were right. She picked up the report again. Read the formal language of the reinstatement recommendation. Read it a second time slowly, letting every word land. My father would have liked this, she said. The notation detail. He always said, forgeries fail on the small things. Nobody can sustain a false hand at the level of the small things. She paused. He would have liked that I found it. Her voice had gone quiet on the last sentence. Not sad, something more complicated. A grief that had made peace with itself. Caleb reached across the table and covered her hand with his, not speaking. Just the same gesture he'd used the night she cried hand over hand solid present, not asking her to be anything other than what she was. She turned her hand over and held his. We need to write to Martha, she said. Yes. And Reverend Cole. Yes. And I need to write to James Whitmore in Boston. Tell him he can stand down. She paused. Tell him I'm all right. I think he's been worried about me for 3 years, and no one has thought to tell him I'm all right. Write all the letters you need to write, Caleb said. There's no rush. She looked at him. At his hand over hers on the kitchen table, at his face in the winter light coming through the window, at the particular steadiness of a man who has never once, not in 6 weeks, not under any pressure, not in any moment. She'd watched carefully for the sign of it, looked at her like she was a problem to be managed or a burden to be tolerated or a past to be suspicious of. Caleb, she said. Yes, I want to stay. She said it plainly the way he'd taught her by example. No hedging, no qualifications, just the true thing stated directly. Not because of the arrangement, not because I have nowhere else to go. I want to stay because this is because you are, she stopped, found the words. Because this is the first place I've been in 10 years where I wake up in the morning and I'm not afraid of the day. The kitchen was very quiet. Then stay, he said, like it was simple. Because for him, it was. I'm going to need to do things, she said. I'm not going to just manage the house and be grateful. I need work, real work. The accounts, the land records, the legal correspondence. I need to be useful in ways that matter. You've been doing that since the 2nd week, he said. I assumed it was permanent. She looked at him. You assumed? I hoped, he corrected. And then I assumed. The corner of his mouth shifted. Is that all right? Something opened in her chest, wide and warm and entirely unfamiliar. The specific sensation of being known by someone in a way that was entirely safe. Yes, she said. That's all right. She picked up a pen and pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her and began to write the letter to Martha. Outside, the snow that had been threatening all week finally arrived. She heard it in the change of sound around the house, the particular soft hush of a world going white and quiet. She wrote steadily, and Caleb sat across from her and went through the ranch accounts, and the stove burned warm, and the lamp was bright, and the afternoon went on around them like any other afternoon that happened to contain somewhere inside its ordinary hours something that would hold.
Chaton.
3 days after the report arrived, the county board convened an emergency session. Caleb and Eleanor attended together. The room was not large, but it was full. Eleanor recognized faces from the valley: Pete Garland, Tom Briggs, and his wife, 4 or 5 others she'd met through Martha or Amos. They were there, she understood, not because the board session required spectators, but because Martha had told them to be there, because witnesses mattered, because a room full of people who already knew the story was a room where a different story couldn't get much purchase. Crowley was there too. He sat at the front with his lawyer and his careful, pleasant expression, and he looked at Eleanor once when she came in just briefly, just enough to assess, and then he looked away. She had expected when she saw him to feel afraid. That was what she was braced for. The familiar cold that came when a man who had power over something she valued was in the same room. It didn't come. What came instead was something clear and flat, and almost impersonal. She looked at Victor Crowley, and she felt nothing except the calm certainty of a woman who has done the work and knows what the evidence shows. She sat down beside Caleb, and he didn't take her hand or look at her with any special expression. He just sat beside her, the way he always sat beside her, which was simply present. And that was exactly enough. The board chairman read the Helena report into the official county record. He read the surveyor's findings. He read the referral to the attorney general. He read it all in the deliberate, careful voice of a man who understood that what he was reading was going to be the record of this meeting for a very long time, and he wanted to get it right. Crowley's lawyer objected twice on procedural grounds. Both times the chairman overruled him with the same careful deliberateness. The vote to reinstate the original survey boundaries was 4-1. The single dissenting vote was a board member Eleanor had already identified from Martha's briefings as a man who owed Crowley money. She noted his name mentally and filed it away for later. When the chairman called the session closed, the room moved with the particular energy of people who have been waiting for something and have finally gotten it. Hands were shaken. Voices rose. Pete Garland clapped Caleb on the shoulder and said something Eleanor couldn't hear, and Caleb's response was brief, and she could see from his face that it was genuine. Martha found Eleanor in the middle of the room and simply looked at her for a moment. "Well?" Martha said. "Well?" Eleanor agreed. Martha put her arms around her. Briefly, firmly, the hug of a woman who doesn't make the gesture lightly and means it completely when she does. Eleanor held on for a moment longer than she intended to. When they stepped back, Eleanor's eyes were dry. She'd done her crying. She was done with the kind of tears that came from fear and duration, and the sheer exhaustion of carrying things alone. She was not done with tears entirely. She knew herself well enough now to know that, but the ones that were left were a different kind, and they could wait for a quiet moment and a warm room. Crowley left the building without speaking to anyone. His lawyer walked beside him, and Eleanor watched them go with the same clear, impersonal calm she'd felt when she first saw him across the room. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been entirely certain of something, and had discovered he was wrong, and was now in the process of calculating his next move, not defeated, not done, but significantly reduced. She thought the Attorney General's investigation will do the rest, and it will not require her presence or her attention. It will simply run its course the way legal processes do when they have been properly initiated, like a river following its grade. She turned away and went to find her husband. The Attorney General's investigator arrived in Cutter County on a Thursday morning in early December, 12 days after the board session, and the first person he came to see was not Caleb Dawson. It was Eleanor. She found this out when Amos came to the barn where she was working and said with his particular economy of expression, "Man from Helena at the door. Says he's with the Attorney General's office, and he'd like to speak with Mrs. Dawson specifically." She set down what she was doing and walked to the house without hurrying, because she had learned was still learning that the reflex to brace to accelerate her heartbeat at any official arrival was something she could choose not to feed. She recognized the reflex. She let it exist without letting it run. The investigator's name was Thomas Aldrich. He was 40 lean, with a methodical manner and the careful eyes of a man whose job required him to read people quickly and accurately. He stood when she came in, which she noted. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, "thank you for seeing me." "Sit down," she said. "I'll put coffee on." She put the coffee on and sat across from him and looked at him directly, which seemed to adjust something in his approach. She saw him recalibrate slightly, the way people did when they came in expecting uncertainty and found something else. "I'm reviewing the land records case and the referral from the Helena office," he said. "I've already spoken with Agnes Holt and with Reverend Cole. I need your account of the notation discrepancy, how you identified it, what your process was." She told him. clearly in order every step of how she'd read the documents and what she'd seen and why it mattered. He took notes. He asked precise follow-up questions, and she gave precise answers, and the whole thing took 40 minutes. And was she realized about halfway through not frightening at all. It was simply a conversation between two people who both cared about getting the facts right. When he closed his notebook, he said, "I want to ask you about something else, and you are not required to answer." "Go ahead." "Crowley's lawyer filed a character inquiry regarding your personal history in Boston. Were you aware of that?" "Yes. The inquiry was reviewed by this office. The death of Gerald Whitmore Hart in 1885. He paused. "Your whereabouts at the time of his death are documented. The Philadelphia hotel record. An attorney named James Whitmore provided a formal attestation 2 weeks ago." He looked at her steadily. "This office considers that matter closed. I want you to hear that directly from this office officially." Eleanor sat with that for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it plainly." "You're welcome." He stood and gathered his papers. "One more thing. In your assessment, and I'm asking because you've read more of these county records than anyone in my office at this point, how far back does the pattern of document manipulation go?" She'd been thinking about this since the board session. She'd been reading late at night, going back through records she'd initially passed over, and what she was finding had a shape to it, a long, deliberate shape. "At least 1881, she said. "Possibly earlier. There are 3 other boundary adjustments in the county records from that period that show similar irregularities. Smaller, less obvious. The Dawson parcel was the largest and most valuable, so the manipulation there was more elaborate." She paused. "I've been keeping notes. If it would help the investigation, I can provide them." Aldrich looked at her with the expression of a man who has gotten more than he came for and is trying not to show his surprise too plainly. "Yes," he said, "that would help the investigation considerably." She went and got the notes. She'd been keeping them in the same leather case Caleb had used to carry the original documents to Helena. She'd taken it over somewhere around week 7, and Caleb hadn't remarked on it. Just started using a different folder for his own papers. The natural accommodation of two people who have figured out how to share a workspace without negotiating every detail. She handed the notes to Aldrich. He flipped through them briefly and then looked up at her. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, "has anyone suggested to you that you might consider formal work in land records review?" She blinked. "I'm a rancher's wife." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," he said mildly. He tucked the notes into his case. "Thank you for your time. The investigation will proceed through official channels from here. You shouldn't need to be involved further." He left. Eleanor stood in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed, and then she went and found Caleb in the south pasture, where he was mending fence with Amos, and she stood at the fence line and told him everything Aldrich had said. Caleb listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "He asked if you'd considered formal work in land records." "Yes." "What did you say?" "I said I was a rancher's wife." He looked at her for a moment. Something behind his eyes was doing the quiet, careful thing it did when he was deciding whether to say what he was actually thinking. He decided to say it. "You don't have to choose between them." She looked at him. Aldrich said the same thing. Aldrich is a smart man. "I just found that out," she said. And then, because the moment felt like one that required honesty, "I don't know what that looks like, working in some official capacity. I've always been working inside someone else's structure, someone else's house, someone else's practice, someone else's name." She paused. "I wouldn't know how to build something that was mine." "Yes, you would," Caleb said simply and without performance. "You've been doing it since you got here." She opened her mouth and then closed it. Amos, to his credit, was examining a fence post with great attention and giving every impression of being somewhere else entirely. "We'll talk about it," she said finally. "Tonight," he said. "After supper." She nodded and walked back to the house, and she carried what he'd said with her the way she was learning to carry the things he said, not to be consumed by them, not to build too much on them, too fast, but to let them sit and find their level. The way water finds its level. The way things settle into truth when you leave them alone long enough. The conversation after supper that night ran 3 hours. Not an argument they didn't argue. She was learning, at least not in the way she'd known arguments before, which were not really arguments at all, but performances of dominance with a winner designed in advance. What they did instead was think out loud together, which was its own particular form of intimacy that she was still getting used to. She talked about her father's practice, about what she'd watched him build over 30 years, not just the legal work, but the reputation, the specific weight that a name carries, when people trust it to tell them the truth about their own property, their own rights, their own ground. She talked about the cases. She remembered the land disputes where the outcome had turned entirely on someone's ability to read a document accurately and explain what it meant to people who couldn't read it themselves. "There's no one doing that work here," she said, "not independently. The county records office is Crowley's operation, or was whoever replaces him will take time to rebuild trust. People in this valley who have property questions have nowhere to go except a lawyer in Billings, which costs more than most of them can justify for what might be a simple question." "You're thinking about hanging a shingle," Caleb said. "I'm thinking about it." She paused. "It would take time to build, and I'd need to be careful about how it was presented. A woman doing land records work independently in 1887 in a county that's just been through what this one has been through. It would require—" "Martha," Caleb said. She stopped. "Martha has been here 30 years, he said. "She knows every family and every property line in this county. If she endorsed what you were doing, people would listen." He paused. "She'd do it. You know she'd do it." "I know," Eleanor said quietly. "That's what I'm sitting with. How much she's already done. How much these people have already given for someone who arrived 3 months ago with one suitcase and a past that could have been used against all of them. It wasn't used against anyone." "It wasn't," she agreed, "because of choices other people made." She looked at him across the table. "I grew up believing that people were kind when they had something to gain by it. My father tried to teach me otherwise. Gerald—" She stopped, started again. "Gerald confirmed the thing my father tried to undo. And then I came here and—" She stopped again. "And," Caleb said quietly, "and every single person I've met in this valley has been kind without any calculation that I can see." She said it like it still surprised her, like she was still in the process of integrating a fact that contradicted a long-held belief. "Martha came to my door with nothing to gain. Cole waited 8 years to speak and never asked for anything. Amos." A short pause. "Amos told me last week that I make better coffee than Caleb, and he's glad someone's handling it." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "He said that—" "Those were his exact words. I make adequate coffee." "You make terrible coffee," she said. "Everyone knows it, and no one told you because you're the one who owns the ranch." He looked at her. She looked at him. And then she laughed a real laugh, unguarded and surprised, the kind that comes before you can decide whether to allow it. And after a beat, Caleb laughed too, the low, quiet laugh of a man who doesn't do it often, and means it completely when he does. The kitchen held the sound of it for a moment after they stopped. Eleanor sat with the residue of it, the specific lightness it left behind, and thought I laughed. Without thinking about whether it was safe to laugh. Without checking the room first. Something in her chest registered this as significant. Filed it. "Build it," Caleb said. The conversation had moved 3 different places, and he'd come straight back to the original point with the focused steadiness that was entirely characteristic of him. "Whatever structure makes sense. Use the back room. It's not doing anything. Put a proper desk in there, proper shelving for documents. If you need a clerk, eventually we'll find one." He paused. "This valley needs what you can do. And you need—" He stopped, chose the words carefully. "You need something that belongs entirely to yourself. That no one can take because it's not dependent on anyone else's goodwill to exist." She went very still. He'd seen it. The one thing she hadn't said directly, the architecture of the fear underneath everything else, The specific terror of building anything on someone else's land inside someone else's life, because she'd done that before and learned what happened when the foundation belonged to someone who could withdraw it. He'd seen it and named it without making her say it first. "Yes," she said. Her voice was careful and very direct. "That's exactly it." "I know," he said. "You've known for a while." "Since around week 3, he said. "When you reorganized the accounts ledger. The way you did it, everything in a system that anyone could pick up and continue without you. I thought she's not building something she believes she'll be here to maintain. She's building something that could run without her because she doesn't trust yet that she'll be here." The accuracy of it was almost painful. "And you didn't say anything. It wasn't the right time." He looked at her steadily. "Is it the right time now?" She thought about that seriously, the way he'd taught her by example, not a rhetorical question, an actual one that deserved an actual answer. "Yes," she said. "I think it is." He nodded once. "Then build it to last," he said. "Build it for yourself. Build it like you're going to be here in 30 years, and you want it to still be standing." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, and for the first time since Boston, she let herself do the thing she'd been most carefully avoiding. She let herself believe in the specific future he was describing. Not as a hope, not as a possibility, as a plan. "All right," she said. "I will." Crowley's formal removal from the county land office came through in the second week of December. Aldrich sent a copy of the official notice to Caleb, and Caleb brought it to Eleanor and handed it to her without comment, and she read it once and set it on the desk in the back room. Her desk now moved there the previous week with Amos's help and Caleb's careful avoidance of the word "I told you so." She didn't feel triumphant. She'd expected to, and the absence of it surprised her briefly. What she felt instead was something quieter, the particular exhale of a long tension finally released. The feeling of a door closing on a room she'd been watching with one eye for months. She wrote to James Whitmore in Boston that afternoon. She told him the official outcome. She told him about the investigation and the Attorney General and the board session. She told him about the land records work she was building. She told him, and this was the part that cost her something to write, that she was well. That she used the word carefully, turned it over before committing it to paper home. She didn't know if he'd understand what that meant after everything. But she thought her father's old partner, who had quietly held her travel money and not asked questions and helped her disappear from a city that was closing in around her, she thought he'd understand, actually. She thought he'd been waiting for this letter. She sealed it and gave it to Amos and went back to the back room and sat at her desk and started building the organizational system for the county property records consultation she was going to open in January. She worked until the lamp needed oil, and then she refilled it and kept working. And when Caleb knocked on the doorframe at 9 o'clock and said, "Supper was 2 hours ago," she looked up with the specific disorientation of someone who has been entirely absorbed in something, and she said, "I forgot." He looked at her face, at the papers spread across the desk, at the precise, organized system she'd built in 3 hours. "I'll bring something in," he said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He went to the kitchen. He came back with bread and cold meat and a cup of coffee and set it on the corner of the desk without disturbing her papers, and then he pulled the chair from the corner and sat in it and picked up the document nearest to him and started reading. She looked at him. "What?" he said without looking up. "Nothing," she said, and went back to work. They stayed in that room together for another 2 hours. Him reading, occasionally asking a question, her answering, both of them working in the easy parallel that had become the texture of their evenings. The house was quiet around them. The snow outside had been falling since afternoon, the deep, soft kind that covered everything and changed the sound of the world to something almost reverent. At 11, Caleb set down the last document and said, "You're going to be very good at this." "I already am," she said. "Not arrogance, just fact." He looked at her with that corner of the mouth shift that she'd cataloged by now, the specific register of his quiet pleasure in her. "Yes," he said. "You already are." The letter from James Whitmore arrived 3 weeks later. It was longer than she'd expected, 4 pages, in his familiar, careful hand, and she read it at the kitchen table in the early morning, before Caleb was up, in the particular private way she'd kept certain things to herself as habit, even now that the habit was less necessary. He had wept. He wrote when her letter arrived. He was not a sentimental man, and he wanted her to understand that, but he had carried the weight of that Philadelphia morning, the morning he'd handed her an envelope of money and put her in a coach and watched her go, and not known if she would be all right. He'd carried that weight for 3 years, and her letter had set it down. He wrote about her father, about the cases they'd worked together, about a conversation her father had once had with him over whiskey about Eleanor, about how bright she was, and how he worried for her. The specific worry of a father who has raised a daughter capable of extraordinary things, and knows the world is not always built to accommodate extraordinary things in women. He would be so proud, Whitmore wrote, not just of what you survived, of what you built on the other side of it. He always said you would find your ground eventually. I am glad it was Montana. She folded the letter and held it in both hands for a moment. She heard Caleb come into the kitchen behind her. She knew his footsteps now. The particular rhythm of them could have identified him by the sound in the dark, and she didn't turn around, but she said, "It's from James Whitmore." He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. "Good news," he said. "Yes." She set the letter on the table. "He said my father would be proud." Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not entirely dry, but the tears were the good kind, the kind that didn't hollow you out, but filled something in. I've been needing to hear that for a long time. Not from Whitmore specifically, just from someone who knew him. Someone who could say it and mean it because they actually knew him. Caleb looked at her across the table. "Tell me about him," he said. "Your father." She blinked. "You've told me what he taught you," Caleb said. "The law, the documents, the numbers. You've told me what he said." A pause. "Tell me who he was." She looked at this man across the table. Her husband. The word was becoming a different word in her mouth than it used to be, losing its old weight and taking on a new one. And she told him about her father. She talked for a long time. She told him about the mornings in the office before school, sitting across from a man who took her questions seriously when most of the adults in her life treated a girl's questions as charming interruptions. She told him about the first case she'd watched him argue, a property dispute, not entirely unlike this one, and the way he'd demolished a fraudulent claim using only a chain of documentary evidence and a jury's willingness to follow logic. She told him about the smell of his pipe and the way he laughed and the absolute bedrock certainty she'd had as a girl that the world was fair because her father was in it and he was always going to be there to make it fair. "And then he wasn't," she said. "And I found out what the world was like without him in it. And then Gerald." She paused. "And then I found out what I was like without anyone I trusted in it." "What were you like?" Caleb asked quietly. She thought about it seriously. "Smaller," she said finally. "I was smaller than I'd been raised to be, and I could feel the difference. The distance between who I was and who I was supposed to be. And I couldn't close it, and I couldn't stop being aware of it." She looked at him. "It's getting smaller. The distance." "It's almost gone," Caleb said. She held his gaze. "Not almost, but getting there." "That's enough," he said. "That's all it needs to be." Christmas came, and with it every neighboring family Martha had ever spoken to, which was approximately all of them. The house was full in a way it hadn't been in years. Caleb said so, walking through the crowded rooms with the expression of a man who is surprised to discover he has missed noise and had not known it until it arrived. Eleanor was in the kitchen when Martha found her pulling her away from the stove by both hands. "You are not spending Christmas in the kitchen," Martha said firmly. "Someone has to. Amos's wife is handling it, and she is considerably more organized than you are, which I say with great affection." Martha pulled her into the main room. "Come and talk to people. Let people talk to you. You've been in that back room for 3 weeks building your practice and nobody has seen your face. People have seen my face. Caleb has seen your face. That is one person. Martha deposited her next to Tom Briggs's wife, a warm woman named Clara, who immediately began talking about a property line question she'd had for 2 years and hadn't known who to ask. Eleanor listened, asked the right questions, told Clara what documents she'd need to dig out and what she'd be looking for. Watched Clara's face go from worried to relieved in the space of 10 minutes, which was, she thought, a very good return on 10 minutes. Caleb was across the room. She could see him from where she stood talking to Pete. Garland relaxed in the way he was relaxed when he was genuinely comfortable, which was different from his usual careful steadiness. He caught her eye across the room briefly, and something passed between them that had no name and didn't need one. She turned back to Clara and kept talking. Later, when the last families had gone and the house was quiet again, with the particular quiet of a space that has been full of people and remembers them, Eleanor sat on the kitchen steps and breathed the cold night air. The snow had stopped. The sky was clear and enormous and thick with stars, the way it only is in places far enough from cities that the sky can be itself. Caleb sat down beside her. They were quiet for a while, just the cold and the stars and the sound of the ranch settling around them. Clara Briggs has a legitimate boundary question, Eleanor said. I know. Tom mentioned it a year ago. She's going to come in next week with the documents. That's a good start, he said. First client. First client, she agreed. More quiet. A good quiet. The kind that two people make together when they don't need to fill it. Then Caleb said, When you arrived, I thought I knew what I was doing. She turned to look at him. His face was toward the stars, the strong profile she knew by now, as well as she knew her own hands. You thought you were solving a practical problem, she said. I thought I was bringing home a wife, he said. Which seemed straightforward enough. Someone to share the work and the table and the years. He paused. I didn't know it was going to be you specifically. You didn't know me. No. He turned to look at her. I know you now. She held his gaze. And he reached over and took her hand. Not the careful, gentle hand over hand from the kitchen table. In her first weeks, this was different. This was the hold of someone who knows the other person and is not being careful, because careful is no longer the mode required. You are the best thing that has happened to me in 12 years, he said, possibly longer. A beat. And you are also the most complicated person I have ever met, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give. Something in her chest expanded so fast it almost hurt. She turned back to the stars and breathed until she trusted her voice. I didn't know it was going to be you, either, she said. When I wrote to the agency, I thought I was looking for safety. I thought that was the most I was capable of wanting. She paused. I didn't know safety could look like a person. He was quiet for a moment. I want to marry you properly, he said. In the spring. When the ground is clear and the neighbors can come. Not the paperwork we did in September. He paused. A real ceremony. Whatever that means to you. She thought about what it meant to her. She thought about standing in front of people who had brought evidence and testified and knocked on doors and sat at tables and treated her from the beginning as someone worth the effort. Yes, she said. I want that. Good. He squeezed her hand once. That's settled then. She laughed softly. That's settled, she agreed. They stayed on the steps for a while longer, long past the point where the cold had a rational argument for going inside because some moments have their own duration and know how to hold it. When they finally went in, Eleanor paused in the doorway and looked back at the sky one last time, at the enormous clean dark of it, at the stars that were exactly the same stars that had been above Boston and above Philadelphia, and above every frightened road she'd traveled. But that looked completely different from here, from this specific ground, from inside a life that was finally shaped like herself. She went inside and closed the door. The following spring, on a morning when the snow had pulled back from the valley and the first green was coming through the brown Eleanor heart. Eleanor. Dawson stood in the yard of the ranch she had come to with one suitcase and a past she was afraid would follow her, surrounded by every neighbor who had become without her, planning it family, and she married her husband again. Properly. On ground that was legally and permanently hers as much as his. Witnessed by a reverend who had waited 8 years to speak the truth beside a woman who had known from the first day that she was worth knowing. She wore no veil. She wanted to see everything clearly. When Caleb took her hands and said the words, she did not flinch or calculate or brace for what came next. She simply looked at him, the steady, patient, entirely honest face of the man who had asked her on the first day if she'd had anything to eat, who had installed a lock on her door before she arrived, who had sat beside her at every hard table and called her capable before she remembered she was, who had looked at everything she carried and called it survivable, and then helped her set it down. She said yes with her whole self, nothing held back, nothing measured out in careful portions. And that was in the end the thing that had required the most courage of all. Not leaving Boston, not crossing 2,000 miles, not fighting Crowley in a county boardroom, not telling the truth after years of protecting it. All of those had required courage, and she had found it. But this standing in the open with nothing between herself and the life being offered to her, choosing it without a fallback plan, trusting it without a guarantee, believing in it, without proof beyond the evidence of everything she'd already seen, this was the thing that asked the most of her. And she gave it. A woman who had spent years making herself small to survive, finally stood at her full height on her own ground in her own life, and discovered that when you stop running from the past, you don't fall. You simply find out where you actually are. She was home, completely, permanently without reservation. And she was never going to be anywhere else.